Welcome to Saving America. This is your host, Dr. David D. Schein. Our series of interviews for Saving America establishes that the world is full of interesting people. Once you hear from our panel, I'm sure that you will agree they each deserve the moniker of interesting person. Saving America welcomes Adam Kissel, Madison Marino Doan, and Rachel Alexander Kahn. Our three guests are here today because they're co-authors of the new book, Slacking: Guide to Ivy League Miseducation. Adam Kissel is visiting lecturer in formal organizations at Trinity College, visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and a board member of the National Association of Scholars. He also serves on the America's 250 and Advisory Council on Civics History and America's Future. It's a master's from the University of Chicago, bachelor's in English and American Literature and Language from Harvard. He served in the first Trump administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Higher Education Programs with the United States Department of Education. Madison Marino Doan is the policy analyst in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Her work focuses on higher education reform regarding affordability and accountability. She also writes on K-12 education choice initiatives. Doan is also a visiting fellow with the Maryland Family Institute, where she writes and comments on issues related to education choice, parental rights, and local education. Previously, she served in multiple roles for U.S. Congressman Brian Babin, Texas 36, most recently as legislative correspondent, where she managed his portfolio on religious freedom and values. Her work has been featured in Fox News, Washington Examiner, Washington Times, The Daily Signal, and the Educational Freedom Institute, among others. She graduated summa cum laude from Lamar University with a double major in economics and finance, has a certificate in humanizing education policy from the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Rachel Alexander Kahn teaches at Louisiana State University, Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady University, and Sequitur Classical Academy in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and teaches remotely for Belmont Abbey College's online master's in classical liberal education. She earned a PhD and master's in political science from Baylor University and her BA from Washington and Lee University. Our three guests are here today because they're co-authors of the new book, Slacking: Guide to Ivy League Miseducation. We welcome Adam, Madison, and Rachel for their first appearance on Saving America. And we're
Thank you,
going to
David.
have a
Thanks for
party
having
here,
us.
folks. And I'm not sure who's going to answer in what direction here, but you can all comment on each. As you know, we ask our guests three questions, and in this case, we'll take what we can get on each one. And the first question is, full disclosure, as a high school student, I worked my butt off to get a scholarship to UPenn in the Ivy League. I was disappointed then, and that was 50 years ago. What has happened to the Ivies?
I think a big part of what has happened to the Ivies is that their long tenure in American society has made them complacent. They're resting on their laurels and their old reputations as legacy elite institutions, and that has let them, as institutions become slackers, to lose their sense of what a high quality education is. And that is at the origin of a lot of the rest of the problems that my colleagues might want to talk about.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks so much, David, for having us on here. We often talk about, so the National Association of Scholars did a series of reports on general education requirements in the Ivy League in the 1990s. And at that point, the complaint or the critique was that students don't have to take courses on Western civilization or Shakespeare or any of the, high level, high quality courses you associate with an Ivy League education. What we found with this book, in which we looked at all the general education requirements across the 8 Ivy League universities, was that now it's actually hard for a student to find a course on Western civilization or Shakespeare. So things have actually gotten much worse. As bad as they were in the 80s and 90s, they've actually declined further, is what we found, unfortunately.
And if I could just add, I would say in our findings, Columbia is the exception with kind of a true core curriculum. However, you have Brown sits at the other extreme with virtually no required content. So, and the rest of the universities, they just kind of fall somewhere in between, but none meet kind of the classical standard of general education, as we've kind of briefly talked about.
Another aspect of this, is the takeover of many of the humanities and social sciences disciplines by what Roger Kimball, who's our publisher, called tenured radicals. These were folks who were the rabble browsers and rabble themselves in the 1960s and 70s. Then they got tenure, and then they reproduced themselves in the next generation of graduate students. So now we have 2 generations worth of decline, faculty members who think of themselves not as educating human beings and citizens in the best that has been thought and said in the world, but producing activists. And I think the courses that they offer in the core curriculum demonstrate this activist turn in American higher education.
And I, of course, and I know exactly what you're talking about because I was actually there right at that time. And as I tell people, I was in college during sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I think some of those people who were doing the real heavy pot and a few other illicit substances ended up as professors in later generations. Maybe nobody else wanted them, so they found their way back into academia, something like that. So, focusing a little bit more directly on your book, slacking is the first word of the title of your book. What caused you, all of you, to decide that that would be the first word for your title of your book?
I think the word came first from me, and there was a college roommate of mine who was part of a slacker subculture at Harvard, where I was an undergraduate. And I thought the kinds of courses that this person was taking and would have taken represent pretty well what I want to get across in the chapters of the book. That the whole attitude of the students who don't want to succeed through academia, through their academic work, but instead do other things in their cultural and personal life, that seems to be the kind of curriculum that is now offered as the norm across the Ivy League. So that if you want to be successful in society and you go to Harvard, you join a lot of extracurricular activities. You don't try to become a good person through your courses. So to me, to get the slacker curriculum would be the way that is the new norm in the Ivy League.
Just to add to what Adam said, the way that we set up this book is we divided the book into 8 chapters, one on each Ivy League university. The three of us divvied up the universities and combed through their university course catalogs to examine each course that could be taken for a general education requirement. And we found that the majority of these courses are what we've dubbed slacker courses. They tend to fall into one of 3 categories. The biggest one is the bucket of ideologically motivated courses. So these are courses that the titles and the descriptions of the courses and the text and questions included in those descriptions betray an obvious ideological agenda, whether it be assuming what justice is or what injustice is, assuming answers to questions about climate change or about, diversity. So some examples of that would be Yale has a course called Managing Blackness in White Space. Brown has a course on how to teach American history through an LGBTQIA lens at the high school level. There are courses on settler colonialism, intersectionality, intersectional disability studies, I think is one that Cornell offers. So these courses are abound. They do make up probably the majority of the courses we reviewed, and they assume answers to difficult questions that students should have to work through themselves. So we dubbed them slacker courses for that reason, not just because there's political bias in the course, but because it actually takes away the work of the student to think through what is justice, what is human nature, what's my place in the cosmos. These courses answer that question for the students, and so they're more ideological and indoctrinating in that sense. We also found a surprising, alarming number of courses that are focused on pop culture topics, so non-academic topics, courses on reality TV or pop music. So Yale has a course on pop sapphism, on lesbianism in pop culture. There are courses on thinking with Bad Bunny at Princeton, on Cardi B and Madonna. And so these are just courses that are obviously not academic in nature and not what you would expect to pay $80,000 a year to study, not what you would expect the cream of the crop of our nation to spend 4 years studying. So that's sort of why we concluded slacking would be a good title, is we looked at all these courses and thought, there's a problem here. Most of the students are not doing the difficult work you would expect them to do at Harvard or Princeton or Yale.
And if I could just add quickly, I think the title is also somewhat, we thought, provocative by design. It's meant to spark a conversation about what education should be and why the Ivies weren't delivering it. So we invite families and even the boards of trustees at the universities to take a closer look at what their core curriculum requirements are.
Do you think the parents, you've mentioned the name of some of these courses, and I'm going to twist this a little bit, but that the parents have actually read these lists of courses? Because I can tell you that even though Penn was going woke when I was there 50 years ago, it's just it was more the attitude of the professors in the classroom. Now I'm hearing the titles of these courses and the requirements, and it sounds like there's been a real different twist to what's happening here. I mean, how does this impact the selection of universities? Do you think people really even know about this stuff? They just hear, oh, it's Harvard, it's Yale, it's Columbia. They go there because of that. They don't go there actually to do the students really pick this stuff out, the parents?
I don't think the parents or the students go so far into the course catalog as they need to really know what kind of education they're going to get. I think you're right when you say people are starstruck by the name of Harvard or Princeton or Penn, and that's almost as far as it goes. If they find extracurriculars they like, or a sports team they like, or some other aspect of the city they like, they're not saying to themselves, which I hope the next generation will say, I got a good classical education, K through 12. I want to extend that and develop myself as I don't see most students saying that right now.
And how would you construct a core curriculum? So you studied these 8 universities, these famous 8 Ivies. How do you put these courses into a core curriculum, or did they just flush out the core curriculum?
Let me go first and say it's a hard question. What do you do to an 18-year-old to make them an educated 22-year-old human being and citizen who's ready for adult life in the world at an elite level, because they're doing something more than the high school graduate is able to do? And what generations of people thinking about this have decided is there's a great tradition of conversation, as Rachel said, about the hardest questions of human being and citizen and the divine. So we want to expose you as a student to the experience of being part of that great conversation, as experienced through what are called the great books and the great ideas. And this is not what Bad Bunny is exposing you to. This is what Beowulf is exposing you to. This is not what Beyonce is exposing you to. It's what Jane Austen is exposing you to.
Yes, and Madison mentioned this earlier, but we did find that the Columbia remains somewhat of a model when it comes to offering a true core curriculum. So Columbia does still have courses that their undergraduates in the arts and sciences have to take in the history of Western civilization. Now there are some new course options in the Columbia core that are more slacker type courses, and so we highlighted those. But at least Columbia does still require students to encounter Plato and Socrates, Aristotle, Machiavelli. And so if we had to offer a model within our book, it would be to recommend these other Ivies to model themselves a little more off of Columbia. One of the main problems, other than just the sheer number of ridiculous courses offered, is that these schools have all adopted distributional models when it comes to general education requirements. So they let students choose what they want to take to become a generally educated human being, instead of doing the hard work that the university is supposed to do of telling students this is what you need to know to become a generally educated human being. They leave that up to the student. And I experienced this a little. I didn't go to an Ivy for undergraduate, but I went to a selective college on the East Coast, and I arrived and I didn't know what to take, and I wasn't given really any guidance. There was no core curriculum. It was just take a handful of courses scattered throughout our catalog. So I think universities outside and within the Ivy can go a long way by actually going back to requiring particular content, particular courses for their students.
You would look like if you're a student and you look for a course that's called something like Classics of Social and Political Thought, a word like classics is going to tell you, aha, there's something good here for me. Or if you see a course called Masterpieces of World Literature, you say, okay, and that will help you decide, even on the course title alone, what you should be taking.
And of course, we're also assuming that the faculty members have a good education and can actually teach those courses. And I'm beginning to get a little nervous about some of the qualifications if we've got people coming through programs like this and then creating the courses that they're teaching. Is what type of classical education did they have that they think that this is a good idea for education for our current generation? So this thing hasn't have we really thought through this whole model? And because it is a concern. And sometimes people say, well, in my professional life I never used Beowulf, which by the way I read in German in college. And but I teach business law. I'm an attorney in addition to a scholar, and I teach business law. I teach business ethics. And one of the classic books that I mention is John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which, in my opinion, is one of the 100 great books of American authors. And of course, he also wrote Mice and Men, again, books that shared with people the historic experience that many Americans went through as America went through the Great Depression and the difficult times associated with it. And it's interesting because I will ask my class, there's a particular point where a piece of business law ties in to a scene in The Grapes of Wrath. And I say to my students, how many of you have read The Grapes of Wrath? Zero. And there's another classic book, and there's also a Shakespeare play. And I'll ask questions about that. And it's like, now I'll say to them, do you know about the Game of Thrones? Most of them know Game of Thrones. But it's kind of stunning because I kind of look at this, but is this a rolling problem? In other words, have we also rolled this down into the high schools? Because I read Grapes of Wrath and I read Beowulf in college, but I read Grapes of Wrath and Mice and Men in high school, ex-English.
You bring up a very important point that someone like E.D. Hirsch also mentions. He says, if you want to have good experiences out in the world with other intelligent people, you need to be part of the cultural life of American civilization and Western civilization, so that when somebody talks about Grendel the monster, you can say, oh, yes, I read that in Beowulf. And when someone talks about the American plains and the difficulty of being in a wagon and trying to survive on the frontier, you need to understand what that experience was like for so many Americans. If you know none of that, but what you know is pop culture, you're not going to have a good experience among other intellectually stimulating people.
I think David, you pointed to two really important problems, which is that for one, a lot of parents of current students haven't had a classical education themselves, just like the professors you're referring to who maybe haven't had a classical education or just a genuinely liberal education. And so when they're looking at colleges with their kids, they don't necessarily know what to look for or know what to avoid. And then secondly, college students are increasingly struggling with literacy, not just with cultural literacy, but with reading comprehension, basic reading comprehension. And so professors who do desire to teach these great texts, Beowulf, Homer's Iliad, they struggle to assign those texts because the students are struggling to read them themselves. So I think it's a complex problem at, that has issues at every level.
There's a
If I
couple
could,
of sayings about Harvard. One is the hardest thing about Harvard is getting in. There's so much
Yes,
grade inflation if everyone's getting A minuses. The other one, which I hadn't heard again until recently, is you can tell a Harvard man, but you can't tell him much.
absolutely. Madison, go ahead.
Um, I just wanted to add on a positive note, I think there is a revival of classical education, at least at the K-12 level. So Rachel has actually done some great work whenever she was a visiting fellow at Heritage and kind of documenting the rise in classical education that we've seen in the K-12 level. And so I think that is something that's, positive and moving forward. Like we're going to have more students educated in a classical manner, especially as we have expanded educational choice programs in states all across the country.
Yeah, it's a fascinating process. And our third question is, how does your new book help those students and their parents who still want to go to an Ivy? What are we telling them?
Yeah, so happily, we did find at each of these schools good courses for students to take. There are few and far between, but they are there. And so the problem really is students aren't always aware of what they should take. So we're hoping our book can serve as a roadmap for students headed to the Ivies to know what they should take. So at the end of each chapter, we break down the general education requirements into two lists. We have a slacker list of basically the worst courses offered, or some of the worst courses offered. And then we have a striver list for students who are striving to get a good education. And those are highlighting the courses students should look for and should try to take. I looked at Yale and Dartmouth. Both of these universities have humanities sequences that students can take basically in the history of Western thought. Brown had a few of those courses as well. So they're there. You just have to know what you're looking for.
It's an interesting challenge. The flip side of that is, as we've all know, it's difficult to get into the Ivies, and they're very expensive. What would you say to parents in terms of where else should they be looking? In other words, what are your alternatives if you say, well, I'm a straight A student at my high school and I've got, great SAT scores or ACT scores. Where else should they consider? In because the school rankings are unfortunately seem to be. I've lost all confidence in rankings, by the way, because of the people that are doing the ranking are the same people who are coming up with these courses, right?
Right. I'll let Madison talk about our college guide at Heritage. Uh, but you should be thinking about a college like University of Chicago's college, which has a small number of carefully chosen courses, for the most part, that educate you in human being and citizen, classes of social and political thought, the natural sciences, the physical sciences, and the writing requirement, which is integrated into the humanities requirement. That's the kind of 75-year tradition that Chicago has with its undergrads that is worth it if the main thing you're looking for is a high quality college curriculum. But Madison, would you take a couple minutes and talk about our college guide?
Sure, sure. So Heritage in 2024 launched our Choosing College with Confidence Guide. We initially evaluated around 300 colleges and universities all around the country. Last year, in the most recent edition, we upped that number to about 987 total university and colleges that we were looking at. And we ranked the three colleges, gave them either a green light, a red light, or a yellow light. The green light is these are our recommended colleges. Yellow light was, hey, it's worth considering. We can't vouch for the entire school system, but we can say that they have these great honors programs or great books programs, other things that students could consider taking part of. And then last one was our red rating, so not recommended. So there were like 25 different metrics that we looked at, from FIRE's free speech rankings to whether or not students or whether colleges have adopted the Chicago Statement on free speech. We also looked at graduation rates, median income post-graduation. We looked at ACTA's, the American Council of Alumni and Trustees, have this great what will they learn, where they actually look at the core curriculum requirements at all the universities. So there was a ton of different metrics that went into our ratings, but Yeah, if you're curious about, if parents and families are curious about looking at taking a closer look at colleges and universities, they could go on the Heritage website and take a look at our Choosing College with Confidence guide.
I think we strove pretty hard to find a green light in every state. So in some states it was harder than others. But if you want to stay close to home, there might be a good college that we can recommend.
And lastly, I would just add one takeaway I've had from this project is that parents and students should be much more conscientious about college visits, going to the colleges they're considering and sitting in classes that they're interested in, not just going to see what the campus looks like or what the student life is like, but actually going and sitting in on lectures and seminars to see what the education that given college provides. So I think that can go a long way for finding a truly good fit and not just, following prestige or the rankings.
And you've mentioned a couple times Bad Bunny, and I have to admit, I have never heard of Bad Bunny until the NFL made a horrendously stupid decision, which it kind of doubles down on the direction the Ivies have been going. And reportedly, he's going to be the featured entertainment during halftime at the Super Bowl. And since I am busy doing real things, I don't watch any sports. It doesn't really make a difference. I know a lot of people watch the Super Bowl to watch the commercials, which I don't think is a sweeping endorsement of what's going on there anyway, but it's kind of interesting. So I got a chance to look him, her, whatever up, and it didn't sound like anybody that I could associate with a pro football team. So this what people I know some people don't like the term, but I can't think of a better term, but this wokeness that has led to the slacking. It seems to have permeated past the Ivies and into social our society in general. But I think that Harvard seems to have caught and I'm trying to remember her last name or his last name, but we talked about this on Saving America recently. Is Harvard has announced that they have a trans person coming over to teach two courses next semester, and the person's name is I know the first name is Vagina. I forget the last name, and Adam's nodding his head, so I think he knows who we're talking about.
I do. I think the person goes by the last name Vagistan. It's very
Yes.
disappointing. And they're teaching RuPaul's Drag Race, some kind of television show. It's low culture, low side of pop culture that Harvard, I think, is doing on purpose to say, we're Harvard, we can teach what we want. We don't want to see these outsiders tell us what to do. And here's an example of that. The first part of your comment I thought was also important because it's the leaders of America who go to the Ivy League colleges, and then you find them in business, you find them running the NFL, you find them in some of the key institutions of society. So if we don't get our Ivies right, it's a big challenge for America.
Well, and it does bleed over. As I mentioned, I did start at Penn, but I attended two other universities. I have two graduate degrees from the University of Virginia, and the the environment that I experienced at Virginia was a more staid and conservative environment. And I got my MBA, and we traditionally associate business schools with not wokeness, with conservatism and doing the hard stuff, the econ, finance, accounting. But it's interesting because in interacting, I've now been a full-time faculty member in business for about 17 years at several different colleges. And I find that my colleagues who are teaching in business do not come from the same political center, if you will, that I do. So it's even bleeding into into business courses and things like that. But it's interesting because I finished my doctorate at Virginia in 2005, but apparently things changed after I left Virginia. And Again, Virginia's not an Ivy, but it's one of the three or four top-rated public universities, along with Michigan and U Berkeley. And it's interesting because um, the Department of Education and the DOJ and a few other people started stomping on Virginia. And unlike some of the Ivies that had a big fight, Virginia's president resigned early. You may have seen that after 10 years of largely moving the school in a non-traditional direction for the University of Virginia. And so it's kind of interesting to see that, but also that shortly after Jim Ryan resigned, they settled the two cases against the University of Virginia for some of this. The DEI, CRT, I'll just use those two acronyms, that seem to have been impacting a lot of higher ed across the board.
The University of Virginia is an interesting case. I remember when Jim Ryan himself interviewed the author of the 1619 Project, the revisionist project about American history, in the rotunda, Jefferson's own rotunda and library at the university. And President Ryan knew what he was doing. He claimed, I think he didn't, but he knew what he was doing when he had her in and personally interviewed her. And I think that's a sign of how far to the left the University of Virginia had gone. What I think happens in business schools is partly that the successful capitalism-loving business leaders and entrepreneurs stay in their entrepreneurship and their business endeavors. The ones who are Keynesian or post-Keynesian come back to the business schools to teach. That's not 100%, but I think that's probably the pattern. And then they say, oh, environmental social governance teaching, that sounds good to us. Corporate stakeholder instead of shareholder relations, that sounds good to us. And the university provost says, yes, that sounds right to me too. And it gets farther and farther left, even in the business schools.
Yes, it's fascinating path. Well, what can people say? I mean, are we seeing this in the sciences also? Because we've been talking generally, we mentioned a lot of what are obviously social science courses or substitutes for English courses. But what about chemistry, biology, that kind of stuff?
In our research, this STEM courses fared much, much better. So for the most part, we saw that the majority of the courses offered to fulfill science or quantitative reasoning requirements were legitimate science and math and economics and engineering courses. But we did see some of this slacking character creeping into the science courses. So at Yale, you can take to fulfill your science requirement a course titled Asian Americans in STEM. And it's not really a science course, it's a course on the history of Asian Americans and their relationship with STEM fields. Similarly, there's a course at Yale, I think it's still at Yale, that you can take to that's on vaccine attitudes, and there's one on HIV and AIDS, but not the actual science of the disease, but on the history and like cultural and political history of the disease. So we did see a few of those types of courses creeping into the requirements. For the most part, they are rigorous.
Yeah.
I think Columbia still has physics for poets as a course. And the only really slacker course at Cornell in the sciences is one where you watch Disney movies about animals and then pretend you're one of the animals and compare yourself to real animals. And that's how you learn some biology. But all the rest at Cornell is pretty solid.
Well, that sounds like I did want to digress just a minute to along the same lines, though, is we've been hearing a lot about medical school education heading in the same weird direction where I believe one of the newer medical schools, Texas is one of the few states that has opened two or three medical schools over the last 20 years. And of course, there's a huge shortage of medical school slots. And reportedly, the dean of one of these medical schools said, "Well, we don't need any white students. We're in business to create more minority doctors." And I'm certainly a fan of creating a diverse medical community, but I thought that type of statement was something that kind of fit with the slacking situation that we're facing in we've been largely talking about undergraduate education.
I'll just say that, so I don't know that much about medical education from a course perspective, but if you're not learning what you need to be a doctor, you're in trouble. So what concerns me are lower admission standards and then lower standards for getting out. But things have gotten so bad from, as you say, a wokeness perspective in the medical schools that a whole new nonprofit has grown up called Do No Harm, which exists to expose and help reform medical schools and medical education. And they find lots of outrages, such as what you mentioned in terms of racial admissions, but also equity projects around the topic of, say, what they call social determinants of health, by which they mean we look at racial disparities and outcomes and we say it must be because of a racist society. Therefore, our doctors need to learn how to be anti-racist, which is almost nothing to do with actually being a good doctor.
Yeah, it's a tough path, and of course, it influences a lot of what we're talking about here. That's influencing the undergraduate thing. We've got a few minutes left. I'd like to give each of you a chance to kind of summarize a little bit, or pitch a particular thing that you think parents and students should think about as they select colleges and select courses.
Yeah, thank you for having us again, David. I think my biggest takeaway from this project would be that parents, students, Americans should pay a lot less attention to prestige and the history and reputations of universities, not just the Ivies, but other highly ranked universities. The reputation doesn't always line up with what's now being offered. So it's very tempting to go for the most prestigious school you can get into, but that's not really going to help you in the long run if it just leaves you with a lot of debt and not much education.
Madison.
Thank you, David, and thank you so much for having us on. Yes, I think, as we're nearing 2026 and we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of America, now is definitely an important time for families and parents to encourage their families and encourage their own children to take a closer look into learning more about America's founding and just having an education that is classical education, and it's based on a lot of the things that the founders understood and knew. So this is just a very important time for us to be able to be thinking about that. And I think our book will help a lot of families start to make a lot of those considerations.
Sounds good.
I would say something like 90% of people who choose to go to college want to get a better job because of their college experience. Well, due to something like the artificial intelligence revolution, if you look a lot like a computer, you're not going to get a job. The computer is going to get that job. If you look like a human being and have those extra skills that you get from a classical education, now you might have the kind of career that you want. So choose your college wisely, but choose your courses wisely. And this is your chance to grow as a person and become the kind of adult you need to be.
And to wrap things up, how can our audience get more information about the three of you and about your co-authored book?
Heritage.org is where you can find some info on me, and encounterbooks.com is where you can find Slacking, but also once you get on the website, you might find a dozen other books from that imprint that also attract you.
Sounds like a winner. Thank you all for being with us today. This is Dr. David D. Schein. Thanks for joining me for this special edition of Saving America. Remember, a new Saving America show is aired on the Brushwood Media Network every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Listen on any of the 16 network stations, Apple or Google mobile app, Apple CarPlay, TuneIn, Smart Speaker, and all smart TVs. Find more information at the brushwoodmedianetwork.com. Please be sure to join us each week. We welcome and love your feedback from our growing audience.